Bank of the West is a longtime corporate partner of the Commonwealth Club, and we are proud to support this relevant and timely conversation today. Bank of the West is a leader in sustainable banking. We use our financial strength to promote and support equitable growth. Our $1 billion lending in the past 3 years to finance clean energy solutions have earned us the recognition from organizations including the Conservation Alliance, Protect Our Winters, and 1% for the Planet. As the second largest agribusiness lender in the U.S., we offer specialization in production agriculture to meet the distinct challenges of this industry. We are supportive of climate-positive policies and working on advancing sustainable farming and solutions. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club team for allowing us to sponsor this conversation.
Climate change is the issue of the day.
It's not just a single issue. It's about our jobs, our economy, our health, our local communities, our natural ecosystems.
This is the challenge of our generation and the next generation. But with this challenge is going to come incredible opportunities, incredible wealth creating opportunities.
It's not a choice between a healthy environment and a strong economy. We need it both.
There's thoughtful middle ground here. There are solutions that should be win-wins for all sides of the political spectrum. And then there's just scientific fact.
Climate change is not a political issue. The science is not political. If we're going to shift the needle on the problem of human-caused climate change and figure out intelligent ways of addressing this problem, we need a smart, scientifically savvy electorate.
We may come from very different backgrounds and very different social statuses, economic, social, racial, cultural backgrounds, but we only have one planet.
My hope comes really from the human spirit. I think people are genuinely good and want to do the right thing.
Climate One is not just about the people on stage, and it's not just about the environment. It's about energy. It's about our economy. It's about how we live. It's about all of us. Thanks for joining us for this live stream conversation, digging deep into the next farm bill. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One radio show and podcast that drops every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you get your pods, and you can submit your questions today in the comment section of the live stream. We'll aim to get to them at the end. I'm delighted to welcome Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Environmental Working Group, and Chuck Connor, President and CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. Scott and Chuck, welcome to Climate One.
Great to be here.
Yeah, great to be here, Greg. Thank you.
Well, we're going to talk about climate and the Farm Bill, and I just want to acknowledge up top here that we're in a kind of national state of mourning again about something, an issue that most Americans support, some changes on gun policy. It's not happening in Washington. Most Americans support climate action. It's not really happening in Washington. So Scott and Chuck, I'd like you to just reflect on that before it feels wrong of me to not address that at this time.
Well, it just breaks your heart. Chuck and I are both parents. It just breaks your heart to think about what parents are going through today in Texas. And I just pray that our leaders can come together to protect our kids. It feels like it's time to finally stop retreating to our corners and reciting our talking points. It's time to come up with real solutions that protect our kids.
Chuck, your thoughts?
I would concur with that, Greg. I mean, it's a national tragedy that has occurred. Your heart goes out just reading this morning about parents, waiting outside the school, hearing gunfire inside, knowing there was no one in there really to protect those kids. I mean, I have 4 children and 8 grandchildren, and boy, that's painful read. It's just very painful.
And is that, gun policy something, does that come up in farm conversations? Because a lot of rural, communities, guns and farms kind of go together.
It doesn't really, Greg, too much. There's a big hunting community out there in rural America and among farm country, but I think there would be acknowledgement that there's that debate, but then there's debate over issues like assault weaponry and that sort of thing. And whether we can differentiate those two, I think is yet to be determined, really.
Yeah, I was riding my bike recently in rural Northern California in a state park on a dirt road, and there was people shooting assault rifles just off the side of the road. Pretty unsettling. Chuck, you say that 10 years ago you couldn't talk about climate with your member farmers. Now you can. What are your conversations like now?
Well, I think, Greg, many, and I would go as far as to say most in American agriculture today, when this issue came up in the 2009, 2010 period, there was great fear among farmers. There was just a thought that climate debate and climate, if you will, friendly policies just simply meant somebody was going to be standing there looking over their farmers' shoulders, telling them how to farm and sort of a micromanaged kind of situation. And I think over time we have shown them that that is not the case, that this is about providing the right information to them. This is about providing, efficiency options. This is about doing it, the best that you possibly can, but all in a manner that gives them complete and total control over their land and their farming operations. And they're supportive of that. And they're growing stronger every day. And I think there's a sentiment out there that, as you described in your opening, Greg, this can be win-win. We can be pro-climate, we can be pro-farmer, pro-farm income. And we weren't there 10 years ago. And it's a much better environment.
Chuck, what's been your personal journey? Was it hard for you to accept climate science as a farmer yourself?
Well, Greg, on our family farm, we've been no-till farming. I think this is our 39th year on that particular farm. There hasn't been a piece of tillage equipment touch that land. And so, we've seen for a very, very long time that there's value. We were doing it, I guess, before climate change was even being discussed, but it just seemed like the right environmental policy. So this is not a new thing to us, and I'm thankful that we're going to have an opportunity for a debate here that involves farmers with their input, and again, something that we believe can be win-win, and many farmers today feel the same way.
Scott, the Environmental Working Group keeps a database of farm subsidies and crop insurance payments. What has your data shown on who gets those payments? Most of those dollars have gone to complex farming operations and households. Tell us where the money goes.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that we need a farm safety net. We need ways to help farmers weather the ups and downs of agriculture, especially now that extreme weather is impacting farmers' livelihoods. And I think also it's the case that most farmers agree that there ought to be reasonable limits on who receives those payments and how much they receive. If you're very, very successful, you probably reach a point where you no longer need the government support. Unfortunately, we don't have meaningful limits on our subsidies. There have been efforts to place a real means test in place. Chuck led some of those efforts when he worked for the Department of Agriculture. And the result of those loopholes, if you will, is that some very, very large operators are getting millions of dollars every year. I don't think anyone, probably except perhaps the family members and friends of those operators, think that makes much sense. And I think there's probably consensus between environmental groups and taxpayer groups and farm groups that we need a safety net. It needs to really be a strong safety net, but we also need to have reasonable limits on who can get subsidies because they're so successful, and then the amounts that they get. I can't imagine any situation where any individual should get millions and millions of dollars from the taxpayer. That just doesn't make much sense.
Chuck, your thoughts on perhaps reviving means testing? And, we live in an age where most of the money is flowing up to the top in this economy.
Well, Scott has identified, I've been in various positions throughout my career on this topic. And let me just say that I actually, these are tax dollars being involved. And generally speaking, me and my organization support transparency when taxpayer dollars are involved. And so in that regard, the Environmental Working Group's long-term effort, I don't know how many years it's been going on now, Scott, but many of putting that information out there I have absolutely no problem with that. I probably wouldn't get a unanimous vote in farm country on that, Scott. You know that, but nevertheless, these are public dollars, and generally speaking, I think taxpayers have the right to know where their dollars are going, including farm programs in that regard. I don't know. Over time, it's a tough circumstance, honestly, Greg, because these farms are changing dramatically. And my family's farm used to be a very, very large farming operation, 30 years ago. And today it is not. There's just been a lot of change around us. And so what would have been appropriate limits, from the farm bills of the 80s, would look like, just completely inappropriate today. We do a farm bill every 5 years, or at least we try, but even in that 5-year period, there can be a lot of change, a lot of consolidation. We can have a whole separate podcast on whether that's a good idea or not, but the simple fact is that it is happening out there. And so we try and address this. This money still does go to family farms, and we have to acknowledge that. I mean, about 97% of our production in this country occurs on family operations, some being very big family operations, admittedly. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and we just need to be very cautious down this path. But again, the transparency is a good thing.
Chuck, if the Farm Bill is written with the notion that we produce too much and need to keep the brakes on, help me understand the role of subsidies. Are we paying farmers to not produce crops, livestock, or dairy, and why?
Well, this has been a paradigm of farm policy, Greg, since the 1930s, where we really began to make, some large crop subsidies during the Great Depression. And I think you could, make an argument in that during those early years of, paying at a time that you were trying to get less production, there could be some conflicts there. And for many years, we had to have government sponsored set asides, just sort of keep that check and balance in work. We have worked for us, but having said that, we're not paying a tremendous amount in farm subsidies right now, Greg, and that's a mischaracterization by some out there. Compared to the farm bills that I worked on for the Senate Ag Committee in the 1980s, we're paying really a lot less in farm subsidies. So I don't see those subsidies having the market impact like they did, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Today, they're a pretty nominal part of the overall income picture for a farmer.
Scott, your colleague Ann Schekinger found that between 2001 and 2020, farmers received $1.5 billion in crop insurance payments for planting crops in flood-prone parts of the Mississippi River Basin. Her analysis argued that money could have been spent to retire or restore lands for carbon sequestration benefit instead. Are we spending taxpayer money in the best way in the flood-prone areas of the Mississippi?
Yeah, well, and let me reiterate that we need a strong farm safety net. That includes helping farmers obtain crop insurance so they can manage their risks. But there are some important lessons to be learned from the flood insurance program that property owners participate in that ought to be applied to the crop insurance program, and especially where you have folks who are getting repeatedly flooded, who are farming very wet grounds, and because of their repeat indemnities from the crop insurance program are increasing the cost of crop insurance for everyone else. So there are probably some opportunities to adjust rates to send the right market signals to folks who are farming places that they might not otherwise farm without the government subsidized crop insurance subsidy. There are also some opportunities to probably make better use of the conservation reserve program, the land retirement program that's been around for many decades, so that we're better targeting those acres at those frequently flooded floodplain lands, partly to avoid those government payments, right? If those are lands that are hard to farm, they're frequently flooded, marginal lands. Let's use our CRP dollars, our land retirement dollars, to try to offer those farmers an easement, in part to, again, avoid the taxpayer cost, but also to get all the environmental benefits especially the long-term storage of carbon in the soil and the wildlife benefits, the water quality benefits that would come from restoring some of those lands. And I think the other, just to quickly say, the other benefit of really focusing CRP on lands that are frequently flooded or hard to farm lands is you're directing CRP acres away from the prime farmland that farmers ought to be farming. And we shouldn't be wasting our precious CRP dollars, our land retirement dollars, on acres of prime farmland only to see that land plowed up 10 years later. There's not much benefit there.
Chuck, your thoughts on reforming that? We all know that the National Flood Insurance Program is broken. Congress has tried and failed to fix it. How about climate resilience in terms of crop insurance?
Well, crop insurance is a complicated issue, Greg. I'm not discounting any of Scott's points, on their face. I think these are always things that we need to look at. There's been a number of attempts in the past to have rates reflect, that risk on that, in that particular region, in that floodplain, so that, a farmer in McLean County, Illinois, sort of the prime farmland of the United States, is not, paying the same insurance for his operation as someone who's, farming in the Wabash River floodplain sort of thing. And I think we've achieved some of that. Would I stand up here and absolutely pound and say, we're there? No, I wouldn't do that at all. And not even close. But I do appreciate Scott's comments on the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. We've collaborated together a lot on that program through the years, and it's had a lot of evolution. And I do hope that down the road, CRP continues to be a vehicle whereby we can farm, as is described, the most valuable land, and where land is highly sensitive, be able to use programs like the CRP to take that land out of production. Now, we're not headed that way yet, Greg, as Secretary Vilsack, just in the last 24 hours is announcing, some exit strategies on certain CRP acres. And I understand the reason for that, but I hope in terms of our long-term policy, CRP is part of that, and that we can continue to focus on lands that are strategic to our overall national interests.
Speaking of Secretary Vilsack, Scott, on this episode, John Boyd, head of the National Association of Black Farmers, says he was disappointed that President Biden appointed Tom Vilsack as Secretary of Agriculture for a third term. He served 2 terms under Obama. How does Secretary Vilsack kind of embody the power of big ag in Washington and the Farm Bill?
Well, I think it's great to have someone who's learning on the job. And no one describes that better than Secretary Vilsack. He walked in on day one in his 3rd term as Secretary of Agriculture, knowing just about everything there is to know about the department he's charged with overseeing. I think the jury's still out on the extent to which he's used his incredible know-how to address many of the concerns that John and other farmers of color have been raising. Obviously, the folks like the former Trump advisor Stephen Miller, through some lawsuits, have frustrated efforts to provide historic debt relief to Black farmers and other farmers of color, which has really tied his hands. But there are lots of other opportunities for Secretary Vilsack to make real progress when it comes to helping farmers of color, including how our subsidy programs work. There are many ways in which racism is embedded in our farm subsidy programs, in particular, how what are called base acres are calculated. So there are plenty of opportunities for the Secretary to make the Farm Bill a fairer farm bill for our farmers of color.
Chuck, you say the Farm Bill is about leveling the playing field. Does addressing systemic racism have a place in the Farm Bill?
I think so. Absolutely, Greg. I think we need to make sure that every farm program that we reauthorize in the Farm Bill, every new program we put in place, whether that's climate related or anything else, there has to be a key element of that of serving the interest of farmers of color. I would, having served, a stint at the Department of Agriculture, this is not an idle problem. It's been a problem. And it preceded Secretary Vilsack. I know John Boyd well. He's a good man, but I will tell you as well, I think Tom Vilsack is working very, very hard to try and reverse, some of these patterns at USDA that have roots going back decades and decades. And I commend him for that and support his efforts, because I think he's trying very hard here.
And for your listeners, Greg, who aren't familiar with this issue, the record is very clear that going back decades, USDA systematically denied farmers of color, especially Black farmers, the same kinds of income support and government loans that were going to white farmers. And so as a result of that, farms that are owned by farmers of color now, those that remain, because so many simply weren't able to compete against their bigger, better capitalized white neighbors, those that remain are much smaller, have less access to capital. And that makes it harder for them to participate in programs like the crop insurance program, where the farmer on average pays 40% of the premium. So we've got to find creative ways to help not just keep the farmers of color we have on the land, but to bring more farmers of color back into agriculture. And we've got to find a way to do that. That includes those farmers. They need to be part of that conversation. And I'm really hopeful that Secretary Vilsack is going to do that.
And Chuck, does your organization reach out to those farmers in color, try to include them in the broader farmer community?
We do, Greg. We collaborate very, very closely with a group called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which they're a federated co-op that represents many smaller co-ops beneath them that have strong interest among, as Scott has noted, farmers of color, but predominantly the Black farmer. And we're very happy with our partnership that we have with those folks. They are part of our Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance and have been working hand in glove with us to, again, achieve on the ground what we're talking about here in terms of policy, and that is to make sure that every existing program and new program is equally available to the Black farmer and farmers of color.
Chuck, your group is part of the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, which has expressed support for climate smart policies under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which are voluntary, incentive-based, and focused on commodity crops. Learning from other sectors where industry, of course, prefers voluntary measures first, and those only go so far. What do you expect from those policies can accomplish, voluntary, incentive-based?
I think they can fully accomplish our objectives here, Greg, and I don't in any way accept that this is a precursor to something mandatory coming down the pike. I believe we can achieve those objectives. We've done it in the past in agriculture. We had the recollect back to the Dust Bowl years and all the problems we had with soil erosion. Through voluntary incentive-based programs, through technical assistance from soil specialists, we have curbed a great deal. I would say almost all of those kinds of conservation problems. When Scott and I probably first met and were working together, Swamp Buster, was a big issue. We were losing wetlands at an alarming rate in American agriculture. We've stemmed a lot of that loss again through these kind of voluntary programs. I see no reason to believe that we can't stem this problem with climate change and the problems that we have out there using this same model. Now it's going to require funding, and we're all going to need to work together. And this is the reason we formed the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, is to bring folks together so that we can all kind of pull in the same direction. But I think if we can continue that pulling in the same direction, these programs have the ability to solve the problem, not just be a beginning to something different later on.
Scott, the two biggest sectors of emissions in the U.S. are the utilities, electricity, buildings, and transportation, mobility. Those industries have also said, well, we got this, voluntary, incremental, comfortable. We'll get there without government regulation. That didn't really prove the case. Is it the case in agriculture that voluntary, incremental will get us to our climate goals?
Well, there's no question that farmers can take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and many are already doing so. The real tragedy of our policy right now is that 2 out of 3 farmers who go to USDA and ask to, with their own money, bringing their own money to the table, and ask the government to help share the cost of practices to use their nitrogen fertilizer differently, or change how they're using nitrogen fertilizer, or change how they're feeding their animals, or how they're storing animal waste. 2 out of 3 farmers who ask for government assistance are being turned away because of our misplaced spending priorities. So just to make that even clearer, just imagine this. So a farmer is going to the government saying, I want to help be part of the climate solution. I want to change the way I farm to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're saying, no, we're saying we're not going to help you. That is ridiculous. And I think every American from across the political spectrum would agree that it should be a big priority for the government to share the costs of those practices. They're not free. They're not free to the farmer, and they work. We know they work. We could always learn more. We're going to learn more soon because of some things that Secretary Vilsack and his team have put in place. But we know there are steps that farmers can do to reduce emissions, especially of nitrous oxide, which is caused by using commercial fertilizers, and methane emissions, which come from animals and their waste. And I think to their credit, Chuck's organization joined with groups like EWG to support a big increase in the spending for these climate smart practices in the Build Back Better bill that has passed the House and is still pending in the Senate. But we need to make better use of the $6 billion a year we already are giving farmers. We have right now that USDA is giving farmers. Too little of that money, which flows primarily through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and the Conservation Reserve Program. Too little of that money is going to practices that reduce emissions, and too much of it is going to practices that either don't do much to reduce emissions, or in some cases even increase emissions. So we need to, I think, while Secretary Vilsack and his team has done a lot to make climate smart practices a priority, and we need more money, as has been proposed in Build Back Better, we need to make much better use of the money that Congress has already provided in the last Farm Bill.
Chuck, some of the biggest optimists I talk to across the climate spectrum are people who are interested in soil regeneration. Soil can capture water, carbon, all sorts of things. It's tough to scale. But that's pretty upsetting to hear Scott say that farmers are going asking for climate smart help and they're not getting it from the federal government. What's broken? What's wrong?
Well, Greg, we've got too few resources. I think Scott laid out the problem, and what he just answered, I wholeheartedly agree with it. I would like to see us, not only rework some of our existing programs in the Farm Bill to really give them a climate focus, but obviously we also, part of the reason so many people are being turned away is just, not enough resources here, and I think. What we call the Title II of the Farm Bill, which is all the conservation title, I think it's a title that needs additional resources. It needs additional resources targeted at programs that have a real strong climate underpinnings associated with them. And again, if we can achieve this, Greg, this is not just a Band-Aid or window dressing. These are real solutions to real climate problems. And I again think it's one that farmers they understand their local NRCS offices. These are people who know their farms. They don't make farmers feel like that someone is coming in and telling them how to run their farming operations. So again, just back to that win-win notion. Title II of the Farm Bill can be win-win, but we are going to need better use of resources and probably more resources when you get right down to the bottom line.
Well, let's talk about the political and economic context for that. We've seen some really big legislation. Really, $1 trillion used to be a lot of money in Washington. Now we've seen several $1 trillion bills go through for COVID. What's the political and economic landscape right now for a more ambitious farm bill? What do you see in there, Scott?
Well, I think probably as all of us are talking and your listeners are listening in, Senator Manchin and other senators are meeting to discuss the energy package that would be the sort of a alternative, if you will, to the Build Back Better bill that has passed the House. Congress still has 5 months. They have plenty of time to pass a Build Back Better package or some version of it that includes the $27 billion that the House approved and that Senator Stabenow has so effectively championed in the Senate for these climate smart practices. So that would be an enormous missed opportunity if we left $27 billion in funding to help farmers reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the table. What a waste that would be. And I think there's not just a really powerful environmental case, right? We know that spending $27 billion on better use of fertilizer, better use of changing what we feed animals, changing how we manage manure. We know those things will reduce nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions. There's also a really strong business case for making these investments. And that's because right now, U.S. agriculture accounts for at least 10% of U.S. emissions. But every other sector, mostly because of policies we've adopted like renewable portfolio standards and CAFE standards, every other sector of the economy is taking steps to reduce their emissions, except for, unfortunately, our farmers. The emissions, when you look at the EPA's greenhouse gas inventory over time, those emissions are going up. And that's no fault of the farmer. It's simply because we are eating more and more meat. We are producing more and more meat for a growing population around the globe. And when you fertilize animal feed and when you raise animals, you're going to increase nitrous oxide and methane emissions. So while U.S. farmers may only account for 10% or maybe 15% of U.S. emissions now, as other sectors reduce their emissions and agriculture's emissions inevitably go up because meat consumption goes up, U.S. farmers' share of emissions is going to go up as well. It could easily be 20% by the end of this decade and 30% by the end of the next decade. And so I think there's not just a really obvious environmental case for helping to share the cost of these practices. I think there's a real reputational risk to our farmers if we don't help every way we can and use every tool in the toolbox to reduce emissions soon, because it's at some level it's just a math problem, right? If we double animal protein demand globally, as many think we will by 2050, and we don't pretty significantly change the way we fertilize feed and what we feed animals and how we manage their manure, then it's just inevitable that those emissions are going to keep going up.
Chuck, the aviation industry had a similar problem. As autos and building emissions are going down, aviation was going up. They realized they had a target on their back. They needed to do something because they were going to be going the wrong direction on something really important. Your response there on reducing agricultural, bending the curve on ag, and a lot of the U.S. subsidies go for commodity crops, corn, soy, wheat. Much of that doesn't go directly to feed humans. It goes to feed livestock. How can that be addressed?
I think it's hard to draw a comparison between autos and airplanes and the food that we eat, Greg, just to be perfectly honest. For those industries, you can talk about, maybe we need, to not buy that new car. Or maybe, we need to encourage people to fly less, or, those kinds of issues. And you can have good and honest debates. We can't have a good and honest debate here about scaling back food production in the United States of America. People who suggest something like that I get wide-eyed with, how can you possibly think, particularly during the times that we're in now. That was a hard one to justify a year ago. In today's environment, where even here in the good old United States, people are worried and having trouble identifying the foods that they need. I don't know that the numbers are exactly right that Scott has quoted here, but there is no question that the United States of America has got to increase our level of food production dramatically in the next several decades, or else the consequences for this planet are in pretty rough shape. Now, again, the good news is I think we can have it all here. I think we can have that increased production that we're going to need, that the world is going to need. I think that can be in animals. I think it can be in other crops, and be that plethora of options that we have grown so accustomed to here in the U.S. And I don't, I'm not one who believes necessarily in a lot of good food, bad food kind of lingo at this point. But I think we can have, those kinds of options available to us, but do so in a responsible, climate friendly manner. And we've talked about how we do that, but in food, it's essential that we do that, because the option of just simply saying, well, no, you can't have it. You can't do that in food, for crying out loud. So we've got to produce it. We've got to, work with them to do it in the best way we possibly can.
I think the criticism would come from, if I could, Chuck, just the criticism would come from industrial monoculture. Feeding, corn, soy to animals is a real inefficient way to take energy from the sun to crops to animals to people. We know that we need to produce more food for a growing global population. I think the question is whether industrial monocropping, which has a lot of impacts, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of externalities, things that are created for that sort of calorie per acre efficiency. So there are people who say, look, organic, more regenerative agriculture, the industrial establishment is not the only way to do it.
Well, again, Greg, I sort of bristle at your characterization of industrial establishment. Food in America is produced on family farms, like my family's own farm. It takes a lot of different shapes and sizes, but these are generational farms, that have been handed down through, passed from one generation to the next. The producers themselves are the ones, they're on the farm, getting their hands dirty, doing this kind of work. So it's not sort of some kind of corporate industrial sort of complex. It's family farmers out there. And that's the reason we have the farm policy we have in this country. Scott and I can, have a good debate on what the right size ought to be. And that's open for some debate, but at the end of the day, they're family farmers. And that's why we try and help them, is to keep these farms in the family, rather than in Wall Street in some capacity, or in some Chinese investment firm or something of that sort. So it's a great system, and we're going to need a lot more of it. And it's not to say it's a perfect system. We've got, you've identified problems that exist out there. There's been a lot of effort to try and solve, some of those problems. There's going to be more effort, needs to be more effort going forward in solving, some of those problems that are created, through improper, use of fertilizers at times. And boy, the industry, part of the industry I represent, they've made incredible headroads just in the last 5 years of applying technology to make sure, that these products do what they say they're going to do, and nothing more and nothing less. And that precision agriculture is so strong out there today. My cooperative members who supply a lot of these products, the demand that they have from their farmer members today is more information about how to do it right, as much as it is about, getting them the products they need. They want the information, and there's more and more great information out there, great ability to do these things better. And we've got to pursue every one of them.
And I'll just add, I think it was President Obama who said, we need big farms and small farms. We need organic farms and conventional farms. We need, but I think we need to make it easier for farmers to choose the practices and tools that Chuck talked about that help reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer, that help change what we feed animals, whether that's what's in the feed mix or adding feed additives to the feed mix. We need to change the ways we manage animal waste to reduce emissions. And we need to do more we need to make that easier for folks. But, consumers have a big role to play here too. And again, if we double animal protein production and consumption, there's no way we're going to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves for the climate, whether it's the goals that we recently restated in Glasgow. So we've got to make it easier for consumers to occasionally, just once in a while, the 94% of us like me who eat meat, I had bacon and eggs for breakfast, the 94% of us who eat meat, to occasionally try and replace an animal protein with a plant-based protein to get a little bit more of our protein from plants. And that's not just good for our health, our personal health, our cardiovascular health. It's not just good for the planet, because it would help reduce many of the emissions we've talked about, the emissions from fertilizing animal feed and the emissions from the animals themselves. It's also really good for farmers because it turns out that America's farmers are and America's, then the companies that turn plants into plant-based foods here in America are number one in the world. We are the best in the world at producing plant-based foods. There are already 55,000 jobs across the country, mostly in rural places, producing plant-based foods. Many of our farmers are producing the crops that are used to make of course, they're all plant-based, so they're all grown by farmers, but they may be crops that you wouldn't think as much about, like peas and lentils and other legumes and so on. That's a great opportunity for our farmers. And it's one we will lose if we aren't smart, because other countries, especially China, no surprise, are making huge bets because they see what we're talking about. They see this growing demand for protein, especially for animal protein. They can do math. Pretty sure they helped invent math, or maybe rediscovered math. I have to check the history books on that one. But they can do math, and they know that there is going to be growing demand for other sources of protein than animals. So if we want to keep that leadership role, if we want to stay number one in the world, which would be great for our farmers, great for workers in rural places, we need to make some bets in the next farm bill. We need to help scale up these companies that are making plant-based proteins. We need to look at subsidy programs for some of these pulse crops, and to make sure that there's an incentive for our farmers to grow these ingredients so they're not being grown, as many of them are now, in Canada or other places. And so I think, Chuck talked about win-wins. This could be a huge win for our farmers, a huge win for consumers, by making it just simply easier for folks who do eat meat to occasionally choose a plant-based option, and a huge win for the climate, because we simply can't eat the way we're eating if we want to meet the goals that we've set for the climate.
The COVID pandemic showed us some of the many flaws in our long supply chains. That also applies to our domestic food supply, where most crops come from one specific area. For example, 90% of the country's lettuce comes from, Yuma, Arizona, a state facing continued water shortage and ongoing drought. Scary things happening with water in Arizona. Chuck, what policy can we take under the Farm Bill to build a more resilient food supply, recognizing the water volatility that we have?
Well, Greg, there's no question we need cooperative weather in agriculture, and that's been the case for a long time. And again, part of our climate debate and our interest in that is no question we've seen some weather pattern shifts that are impacting food production. I will tell you, though, that our assessment, sort of post-COVID, if you will, and I realize it's not fully post-COVID yet, but in many ways it is. The resiliency that we showed, during the last 2.5 years in American agriculture has been a pretty remarkable system. There were hiccups, and there were days where my hair was on fire running around on various things, and I look back on that and smirk a little bit, because at the end of the day, food got delivered. We had a dramatic shift in how consumers acquire their food in this country, and for the most part, it was a pretty seamless shift. And again, we can all point to the hiccups, and every one of them got a lot of media attention, whether it was, pigs piling up in Minnesota or, whatever the case may be. But on the scale of food production in this country, it was a, fractional percentage point. And I just found it to be a remarkable system, how we evolved during the course of COVID and continued to feed people, albeit very, very differently than what we had in the past. I'm still hoping, living here in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, where so many restaurants have closed. It's been a tough time for those small businesses out there that are equally important in our food, production system in this country. And they've had a real rough go of it. And I'm hoping as we exit this pandemic that some of those small businesses can come out and we can continue to have restaurants and a food system that offers a little bit of everything to, just about everybody across America. And that's the remarkable part of our system, is how diversified and hopefully resilient it is. And I think, we need to do everything we can to help it stay that way. And that's not to say there shouldn't be some really heavy duty post-COVID analysis of all of these issues. And if there are areas where we failed, we need to fix it. No question.
Another disruption has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which affected fertilizer supply, et cetera. Scott, what is the impact of that, and could that impact on fertilizers help more farmers to move to less, nitrogen, less kind of chemical based practices for their fertilizer?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. As Chuck knows, and certainly as members know, fertilizer prices are very high right now. Farmers are already taking steps to use fertilizer with greater care. There are lots of opportunities to go even further, whether it's changing the timing or the amount, or even the kind of fertilizer you're applying to try to make sure that more of that fertilizer is used by the plant and less of it winds up going up into the air as nitrous oxide or into our drinking water supplies, where our water utilities ultimately have to help take it out. So that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity. I think, the other thing I wanted to mention, and this is an area where I'm confident Chuck and I don't agree, is that in addition to trying to make it easier through incentives to make better use of our conservation programs to reward farmers when they reduce nitrous oxide emissions, we think we need to take a hard look at the deal that taxpayers struck with farmers in 1985 and ask whether it's time to rethink that deal to also address some of these nitrous oxide emissions. And for your listeners who weren't part of the 85 Farm Bill or haven't read Jonathan Compass's great history of Farm Bills, including the 85 Farm Bill, what happened in 85 was Congress cut a deal where they said, farmers will give you more subsidies, but in exchange for that, you have to take steps to reduce soil erosion. And it's been one of the biggest conservation achievements in U.S. history. We saw huge reductions in soil erosion as a result of that agreement. And I really believe, we really believe it's time to re-up that deal and say, look, we want to provide you a farm safety net that is robust. We know farmers are going to be dealing with more and more extreme weather because of climate change. But in exchange for a renewal of that deal, we'd like you to help us by doing more to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. And there are lots of ways that farmers can do that. But as we've talked about on this call, a lot of them depend on the goodwill of farmers like Chuck and others who've been doing it right for decades. A lot of it depends on the availability of federal funding, which can be really fickle depending on who's in the White House and who's in Congress. So kind of expanding that deal to cover nitrous oxide emissions is something we think it's time to have a conversation about.
Chuck, your thoughts on that? Broadly, kind of using the Farm Bill to promote regenerative agriculture.
Well, Scott is an articulate spokesperson on this. I think I would. We don't totally agree on this. I would say, Scott, a factor that we have to put into the equation on that, and I so appreciate what we've achieved through Sod Buster and Swamp Buster back in the mid 1980s. But also, you've got to recognize that in the mid-1980s, the government payment that farmers were receiving was accounting for a substantial portion of net farm income and a substantial part of an individual farmer's income. The old joke from those days was, farmers got more income through their mailbox than they did through their grain bin. And that's not the case today. I mean, right. A fraction of the percent of farm income is coming from the government and coming from those same government payments that we heavily depended upon. So I don't think it's probably fair to put those just in the same basket and say we would have the same results on that. Greg, you mentioned the Ukraine and fertilizer, and I will just tell you that, this is kind of what keeps me awake at night, particularly in the short term, where we are having a lot of concerns raised, not only in the planet in terms of food availability, but even here in the United States with shortages of everything from infant formula to eggs being in some cases much higher. I won't say unaffordable. That's not a good platform for me to stand on as an agriculture person in this country. But they're clearly heavy inflationary times in agriculture. we need, big production here coming up. And in the short term, that is going to mean we need, those traditional fertilizer supplies to flow in this country: nitrogen, potash, phosphorus. The first two of those, we have big domestic production here in the U.S. When it comes to potash, though, we import 90+% of our potash into this country in order to produce the crops that we need. And I might add, a lot of that potash is imported and used in organic production as well. So we've got a challenge to make sure, as the world is scrambling to line up alternative supplies to Russia and Belarus, and the impact that that's having, that we need to, the U.S. farmer to be in there in line as well, to make sure we get those fertilizer products for the 2023 production. Because again, without big crops, big production coming in, there's going to be consequences on the planet that are very, very ugly.
One area. I'm sorry, I was going to add one area. I'm sure, Greg, that Chuck and I do agree is an area that we touched on earlier, which is our land retirement programs and not locking up prime farmland that could be growing corn and soybeans and wheat and some of those other crops I mentioned that can go into plant-based foods. Because there is going to be more and more pressure on prices, that's ultimately going to trickle down into the prices we pay in the grocery store.
Yeah, food inflation and stagflation be a big issue, surely, in shaping this farm bill. As we get to the end, food waste is a big climate lever. And the 2018 Farm Bill introduced some measures to help reduce food waste. A report from the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic is pushing Congress to build upon those efforts in the 23 Farm Bill with better prevention, recovery, and recycling. California has a new law requiring people to divert food waste from landfills and help create a supply of compost that can be spread on rangelands. Scott, how likely is it that additional food waste reduction measures can be made into the next Farm Bill?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a role for the federal government to play here, and setting goals. Especially EPA has set some ambitious food waste reduction goals, and providing technical assistance to states and local governments. But ultimately, a lot of the changes that are going to have to be made are going to have to be made at the local level. Just like we need to make it easier for folks to occasionally choose a plant-based option in lieu of an animal protein, we need to make it easier for folks to avoid wasting food. And whether it's consumers in our homes or restaurant owners or food retailers, we just haven't built the infrastructure that makes it an easy decision for folks to avoid wasting food. And there is a big opportunity, because so much of our food is wasted, to have a big climate impact if we get this right.
But Chuck, we have a question from Joy listening, says, aren't all small farmers and ranchers at a disadvantage with existing policies? Are all small farmers and ranchers at a disadvantage with existing policies, suggesting that there's a bias toward big?
Yeah. Again, Greg, maybe this is in the eyes of the beholder. There's no question. We've seen consolidation on our farms and ranches. The example I use is, where I was born in Benton County, Indiana, the little 2-mile stretch of road that I grew up on, used to have 7 or 8 families, living on that stretch of road with houses and playgrounds and, everything, that you would want in a family. And today it's just my family's farm is really the only farmstead that's left on that little road. And I don't think that's a consequence of farm policy, Greg, and to the person asking a very valid question on this. I mean, there's just, like everything else in America, technology has driven a lot of change, and some of that, even for an old farm boy like me, that's tough. It's tough to see some of that change. But if you don't change with it, it does make it tiresome. I really don't see our farm policy having a huge effect on that. We work very, very hard to make sure that the programs are available regardless of size. Scott and I have debated a little bit, should there be a top end limit on this? And that's a valid debate, but I don't think that's going to in any way probably curtail a lot of the consolidation that's occurring out there. When I left the farm, we used a 4-row corn planter. Today, 24 rows, 36 rows. I mean, it's just incredible technology that exists out there. And that's going to drive some farmers out of business because that technology doesn't come cheap. And when you have it, when you invest in that technology, you're going to try and run a lot of acres through it. And that's not a function of farm policy. That's just a function of the world that we live in today. But it's a great question to ask. And it's one we always, need to review with every farm bill. Because again, we want to be there not only for the small farmer, but as Scott and I have already talked, we acknowledge there's a problem here with particularly the small farmers of color, and that has to be rectified.
Yeah, and I would just add that Indiana, Chuck's home state's a good example of this, where based on the data we've collected and put on our farm subsidy database, you can see the top 10% of farmers who get subsidies, who are recipients of subsidies in Indiana, collected about 76% of all the payments since 1995. And so while some large operators have collected hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in that period, the bottom 80% of recipients in Indiana got about $8,000. So it's clearly, as Senator Grassley and Chuck's old boss, Senator Lugar, have said for many decades, this disparity in payments is creating an unlevel playing field for small farmers, where they are getting outbid for land and in ways that has had a big impact on the consolidation that your listeners worrying about. There are a lot of other factors, and Chuck's talked about them, no doubt, and technology being among probably the biggest. But there are certainly ways that our farm subsidy programs, because the payments are concentrated among the largest and most successful producers, are helping to kind of fuel that race for more land, a race that small farmers, especially farmers of colors, really don't have much of a chance of winning right now.
Yeah, Greg, if I could jump in here real quick, I want to add one additional comment that has come to me because it is such a good question that's been asked, and that is the issue is complicated by the fact that when we talk about those smallest recipients of subsidies, those people maybe just getting a few $100s, we've got to remember that what the demographics are in American agriculture, and that is we have, a group of full-time farmers that really get sort of almost 100% of their income from the farm. But then the vast majority of the farmers in America are those that have off-farm jobs, and they farm, some of them might even be a bigger farmer. They might farm a little bit. I don't think our farm policy should be, small, tight subsidies that end up going to the banker in town who happens to have, a quarter section of land out in the country that he, had, and yet he's making $200,000 a year as the local banker. Right? So it's, it gets very, very complicated when you try and target this sort of thing and have an impact. Ideally, if you could identify him, you would want the sort of commercial sized farmer that, all of their income is dependent from the farm, or a good portion of it is dependent from the farm, and not, the banker who has a few acres or something like that, or the super duper large farmer. And that's a difficult balance to achieve, honestly. And we debate that every farm bill, and I don't think anybody would claim we've necessarily found the exact sweet spot.
Right. So Senator Jon Tester shouldn't be getting some of that. We have to wrap it up there. I'd like to give a shout out to the Climate One team for making this happen. Adam, Austin, Ariana, Brad, Steve, and Sarah Catherine. Thank you for making this a lively, engaging conversation possible today. On Climate One today, we've been digging deep into the next farm bill with Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Environmental Working Group, and Chuck Connor, President and CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. This episode has been generously supported by our friends at Bank of the West. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Talking about climate can be hard and difficult, can also be exciting, as you've seen here today with these two, Scott and Chuck. So please give us more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. So thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody. Thank you, Chuck and Scott.
Thank you, Greg.
You.
Enjoyed it.